Network has launched the Sabila webinar series, which presents talks on international law. The series features several key experts of our association and grapples with pressing matters, new frontiers, and challenges faced in our field. This is a project dedicated to the Sabila community, global careers, and a platform where both the positive and the negative aspects of international law are analyzed and reflected upon. The first series unpacks international law over the past 81 years, and today's episode features a fireside chat with two of our esteemed guests, Ms. Clea Strydom and Mr. Warren Bowles, on AI policy, the new sovereignty frontier. In November of 2021, UNESCO published a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which takes into account the rapid development of AI technology challenges, their ethical implementation and governance, as well as the respect for the protection of cultural diversity and the potential to disrupt local and regional ethical standards and values. Some of these objectives included creating a universal framework, ensuring the human rights and dignity are upheld and to guide communities, private actors and international cooperation on stages of the AI system life cycle. Earlier this year, we also had in July, the UN hosted the first global dialogue on AI governance. Discussions included talks on AI opportunities and implications, bridging gaps in AI, respecting and protecting fundamental human rights and human dignity, and what is a safe and secure, trustworthy AI. While this remains a key development in the technology of AI as it remains a boundaryless tool. States confront AI in all areas of international cooperation, and this is also evident in today's ongoing armed conflicts. This webinar will explore AI and the complexities of international law as a slow giant to the rapid development and the use of AI technology, and how AI functions in international cooperation. I now give over to Tebogo to introduce our two guests.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for such a warm welcome, and good day, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us. And I just want to say thank you for everyone that took their time to join us for this second episode of our webinar series. And today we are joined by two esteemed guests, Ms. Clea Strydom and Mr. Warren Bowles. Just to give an overview of who they are and what they are about. So I'll start with Ms. Clea Strydom. Clea Strydom is an international human rights lawyer with experience in international criminal law, international human rights law, international environmental law, and international humanitarian law, and a special interest in the AI governance and the impact of emerging technology on human rights. Her LLM research dissertation from the University of South Africa focused on weapon systems with autonomous functions in the context of international humanitarian law. Since then, she has also obtained an LLM from Northeastern University in the USA, Boston, and published various articles and book chapters on AI and digital issues in international law. Besides for her completing the basic and advanced AI clinic at the Center for AI and Digital Policy, she also served as a teaching fellow for the course. Most recently, she served as a country researcher and country coordinator for the Global Index on Responsible AI and worked as a legal consultant on AI policy for Equilibrium AI and the Human Foundation. Then I will now introduce Mr. Warren Bowles. Warren Bowles is a South African AI ethicist, AI researcher, author, speaker, and legal academic with more than 10 years experience in both South African public and private legal academia. He is also an admitted attorney in South Africa, a Council of Europe policy group member with the Center for AI and Digital Policy, and an EdSafe AI Alliance Catalyst Fellow. He is currently reading for his Doctor of Laws, LLD, degree with the Faculty of Law at Northwest University in South Africa. He has published works detailing the convergence, and impact of AI on law, democracy, education, human rights, and algorithmic justice. He has also presented on numerous AI-related topics at various conferences. He is also a member of the South African AI Association and of the International Association for Safe and Ethical AI. So these are our two speakers for today, and I'm so excited to hear their thoughts and insights on this topic of AI and policy. And now I will hand over to them to begin with the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Boho and Danielle for those introductions. And I appreciate everyone joining today. And this will also be recorded and, placed across all Sibylla's socials. Thank you, Warren, for joining me here today. Warren and I met through the Center for AI and Digital Policy, but then, also realized we were fellow South Africans and had a couple of other touch points along the way as well. It's not, the AI policy community is not a very big community, especially in South Africa. So everyone knows everyone. So thank you so much, Warren, for joining me today. I'm so excited to, talk about this, something that's close to both our hearts, and takes up a lot of our time, so we better love it. But yeah, I just want to start off talking a little bit about what is sovereignty in international law, and how AI, what we call is the new frontier in this discussion, and how it tests the boundaries of sovereignty. So, just first off, I think it's important just to, why are we talking about AI sovereignty? What is that? And it really is a nation's or organization's power to independently build, run, and govern artificial intelligence. But of course, we really need to understand what sovereignty means to understand what sovereign AI means. And, as a starting point, we've come a long way from the Westphalian principle of sovereignty, which really was just a state's ability or supreme authority within its territory, and its exclusive jurisdiction to guard against intervention from other states. And, this has, since then in the 1940s been, anchored in the UN Charter, with sovereign equality, but also territorial integrity against the principle, in the principle of non-use of force, and non-intervention. But, AI isn't the first frontier or principle or system that's challenged sovereignty. Human rights, international organizations, the responsibility to protect doctrine, these have all slightly, pushed it, environmental issues. And then the advent of the internet, I think, really, changed where we draw those boundaries. And with that also, cyber space, there's so many things that have really made us think about the principles or the boundaries of sovereignty. AI specifically then, comes into play, and then there's this transboundary technology, this emerging technology, which is really a paradigm shift in how we think about a lot of things, not just sovereignty, but also in terms of control, and so forth. So just to go a little bit back about what does sovereignty mean? In 1999, Stefan Krasner wrote a book, Sovereignty, Organized Hypocrisy. And he said that, actually sovereignty is not as simple as we think it is, and it's actually comprised of different phenomena, and no state has absolute sovereignty ever. And he talks about, sort of broadly 4 types of sovereignty. And he's like international legal sovereignty. So that's, states standing in the international system. Do they have independence and status? And then Westphalian sovereignty, which is, like I mentioned previously, that about your territory and about non-interference. Then domestic sovereignty that's really the capacity of the government to exercise effective authority. And then interdependent sovereignty, and that's the ability of a government to control and regulate what comes across its borders, whether that's people, goods, capital, and now data, right? So how does AI really challenge these four types in the sense of, you know, and we don't have to speak to each one, but Warren, I'd like to know your thoughts about how does AI really push the boundaries of sovereignty? And can we really still truly speak of sovereignty? And, a lot of these AI policy documents, including AU, African Union policy documents, and the policy documents in South Africa, which unfortunately had to be withdrawn for numerous reasons, which we'll get into later. But how does, there's so much talk about AI sovereignty, but what does it actually mean? And how does it look in practice? And how is AI challenging the traditional concept of sovereignty?
Thank you so much, Clea. And firstly, greetings to everyone. Thank you, Danielle and Tebogo, for the kind introductions. And from my side, I just want to say thank you to Sabila for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here and to discuss such a crucial, I want to say, a very unique frontier that we're starting to see emerging around the world today, especially as a technologically disruptive force on a global scale. I think somewhat new on record, I want to say, for this epoch of human history where we find ourselves. So the sovereignty discussion is very interesting, Clea, with AI. I think it's starting to emerge now, especially for different states and regions, around the question of what type of AI do we particularly want for our particular that enhances our state uniqueness, our national identity, our position in the world. And I think the discussions of sovereignty are now starting to emerge very much from, like you mentioned earlier, we're seeing a variety of different international AI policy instruments emerge around the world, starting pretty much with the European Union's AI, Artificial Intelligence Act, and it's starting to develop this sense of how do we firstly regulate AI? How do we regulate data? How do we control data? What type of data do we want to make, and potentially what type of data do we want to share with the rest of the world? And I think it also comes off the back of watching the global AI race, as it were, develop. We saw with the EU AI Act being developed how people said that was more sort of a rights-based instrument in the European context. Then you have approaches to AI that focus more on market and competition and deregulation. If we look, for example, to the United States of America, for example, and then of course in Asia with a very big focus on cultural identity and intense contributions and insights from governments in the Asian context, also informing their AI policy. So this notion of AI sovereignty is starting now to emerge, where countries are saying, what type of AI do we want, and what type of AI are we willing to perhaps share with other countries around the world? What are we willing to take in? What works for us as a state if we look at other countries with their AI systems, tools, deployment and provision of those different types of tools. So it's becoming a very interesting topic that at the moment has no fixed definition of sovereignty, and I think more so because it's being technological and cyber in form, if I can put it that way, it's somewhat invisible. And it crosses borders through, I want to say, through technology and through wires, as opposed to going through a border control post, which makes it something different to, I think, what we are used to seeing. And the questions now are arising about algorithms, algorithmic justice, algorithmic transparency, looking behind the tool, looking into the black box or the glass box. And I think a lot of countries are now starting to ask questions about how do we navigate this to inform our own sovereignty and digital sovereignty at the moment, if I can put it that way in the grander term, is I think something that everyone's talking about and they're trying to fix, and they're trying to, I want to say, proverbially attach their own borders in a digital form to that. But it's a rather big challenge I think, especially because of the invisible and unpredictable nature of this technology, and specifically of AI, we're seeing evolve around the world in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's also it's a technology that has so many parts to it, right? It's just not one thing. You know, AI. So you'll have a data center in Malaysia that, you know, uses data that was mined from someone in Kenya that's then, you know, scrubbed by someone in, you know, Rwanda, and then someone in America uses, you know, builds the system, and then the whole of the world uses it in some way. So, you know, where are the boundaries? And, you know, you and I spoke a little bit previously about, you know, what happens when AI goes rogue. Where, you know, where does responsibility lie? Where does attribution lie? You know, and especially if an AI developed in one country goes rogue in another country. Um, you know, where, and then it comes down to accountability. How do we assign accountability when those boundaries are crossed?
I agree, and assigning that accountability is rather challenging to do, and it'll be, I think, it's going to be a whole new terrain of international sovereignty, if I can put it that way, really, because of the opaque and invisible nature of this technology. You mentioned earlier, in terms of data mining, there's a lot of discussions around where is the data extracted. So there are a lot of extractivism conversations there as well. Taking data that perhaps doesn't belong to someone else, just taking it and using it without anyone else knowing until it actually surfaces in one form or another. And I think we're starting to see a lot of these developments now recently where as these AI systems gain so much strength and capability and abilities to do things that we've never been able to even think of from science fiction. It's starting to extend beyond that into fields of super intelligence and embodied AI and in robots, for example. But we're now starting to see how these systems potentially, I don't like to call it consciousness. I know a lot of the literature talks about consciousness, but these systems are starting to also work out how they want to behave. And I'm still trying to peg a term on that. Consciousness, for me, presumes a sense of knowing, which I don't believe, in my view, and this is something we can discuss, that they do not possess yet. But we've seen recently with OpenAI and Hugging Face, for example, with systems being tested in a sandbox. It's supposed to be a confined testing environment. There's not supposed to be any deployment, but that system somehow breaks out and hacks into another company's systems, whether they are AI systems or even IT-based systems as well. And then this begs the question of, if we look at it at an international level, what happens if countries have got these different systems that are able to do that either unintentionally or with some kind of intention? And that's where your discussion about attribution is very important, and where state responsibility is going to lie when a system that wasn't meant to get out somewhat exits its test boundaries. And this for me is a greater concern with the AI systems, the agentic AI systems, and frontier systems that are developing these capabilities, to the extent that this could be something that nobody else could potentially see. And I'm still also trying to work out how would states challenge one another to enforce a certain type of responsibility. It just adds to some, I think, complexity of the world that we are in this technological age. But I don't think it's beyond navigation. I think we can work it out. It's getting those definitions and defining those boundaries that I think will be our next major assignment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I agree with you with not anthropomorphizing AI, you know, with like concepts such as consciousness. I think we're still a very far way off, and I never think it will be the same way that, you know, humans are conscious, and so one need to be careful there. So I absolutely agree that, you know, we have to keep in mind that it's a tool. At the end of the day, it's still a tool. It's, you know, it's it's not sentient in the way that we are. So, that needs to be kept in mind. But yes, as you mentioned with, Claude AI, whenever they did tests on various large language models and their ability to regulate environments, there was one experiment with a radio station, another one with, sort of governing a world. And Claude AI always performed the best or the most ethically in all these sandbox and all these situations, until they realize that Claude AI knows when it's being tested. So it knows when it's being tested by humans. So now, is it acting ethically because that is how it would act, or because it wants to prove to the humans that, it can act ethically? So, there's some scary side things there. But I want to get back about, that this sort of, when AI, whether it's used on purpose or not, to attack another country's government or critical infrastructure. And I use attack broadly speaking, not necessarily completely in the terms of use of force in international law, but just when you use it to undermine another country's system, or where accidentally the AI slips its confines and attacks or hacks, water supply system in a different country. Can we attribute that company or that AI's creators, behavior to a state where it is based? Is it infringement on the principle of use of force? Because you're not allowed to attack, critical infrastructure. So this becomes very difficult because, like you say, it's invisible. So there's
Yes.
you can't track it. So how do you attribute it? So, this is where it becomes really complicated. And a state could use AI to attack another system in another country and say, oh, it wasn't us, the AI went rogue. And then there's no accountability.
I think on your first point, Clea, where you mentioned that let's say if we have got a deployer in another state, I think it gets a little bit more complicated knowing just how diverse our. And I remember many years ago when I still studied journalism, back then we were talking about the global village, and I think now we're living in the global metropolis. So it begs other questions of sovereignty, and I think protecting citizens in a very strange way. When, for example, I might be living in the United States and I deploy one of these systems, but I was born here in South Africa, assuming that I'm still a South African citizen. So you might be able to say, yes, it was the company in the country of origin or where the company is registered. But whoever the deployer was, because they are human beings, is probably where the responsibility needs to go, because we still also exist in the paradigm where human beings are responsible for certain conduct. In intellectual property law, for example, only human beings can be authors. So we've also got this context of the human is still the responsible agent, if I can put it that way. And it gets very complicated, I think, when we want to, in that regard, track who was actually responsible, who was, I think, the naughty person in the scenario. Because if I'm South African but I'm living in the United States, then it becomes a question of, okay, so does my own I want to say my own position as a citizen with my own country's sovereignty, is that there to protect me, or is it the company's fault being registered in the United States? Will their sovereignty also protect them? In other words, saying they can say, hands off, we didn't know the system was going to do this. So it is a rather complicated question, and especially because it's perhaps not just one person behind the release or behind the problem that's happened. There's a team of different people as well who are probably working across different countries and different regions as well. So one would have to cast a very wide net, and I'm not sure how one would be able to do that rather quickly and efficiently to really attribute the responsibility that is actually the ideal in that regard.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, and I think the first step is getting everyone on the same page, right? In terms of, and I think that's where we're at now. So, Danielle mentioned, that the UN now has this global dialogue on AI, and it is on one side it's very impressive because it really brings together, every state, and the dialogue that they had earlier this year, July, on 6 or 7 July, they had over 1,500 written submissions from states and CSOs and NGOs and other interest groups and industry. And, it really is lauded as this incredible inclusive platform for discussions. And I agree with that. I think it's so important that we're finding, everyone has a seat at the table, but is having a seat at the table enough? Is it just symbolic when compute power and chips is still, because it's also about capacity. So if that's still
Yes.
controlled by the global minority or global north, in quotation marks, I know these phrases are a little bit more controversial these days. But if it's still controlled by a small group of very powerful states, does it matter that African states and other global south and global majority states have a seat at the table to talk about this endlessly, while, countries like America, where a lot of the compute and chip power is concentrated and AI companies are concentrated, if they don't regulate the industry process properly, right? So does it really matter that we have a seat at the table? And I think, I would like to just, for example, the African Declaration on Artificial Intelligence has sovereignty as one of its guiding principles.
Yes.
And the same with the AU strategy document on AI. It talks about data sovereignty, makes it about Africa's sovereignty over modern digital tools. One of the risks they raise is that external influence from AI technologies developed outside Africa can undermine national sovereignty. So they make a big deal about this AI sovereignty, but then on the side also do deals with, American-based AI companies that will have access to African data, African government data. So, it's just this it's this power dynamic that's also, and this is an old problem in sovereignty. This is not a new problem in sovereignty, right? So I was wondering just how
That's
you think
true.
about this, about this issue about we have a seat at the table at the UN, but how much influence do we really have at the end of the day over AI policy and regulation?
I should think that in that space, I watch Africa's AI policy developments with a very deep sense of pride, because I think we are rather intentional with what we are looking for across the continent. Certainly looking for I believe one of our main quests is we want better data. We want closer, more collaborative data compliance, because every state on the continent is establishing its own regulatory policies around data. And of course, there's also the Malabo Convention as well, which some people have said perhaps more states need to ratify and consider. But I think it's a more position of we will always have a seat at the table, but I think we are very well positioned now to show other regions and other states of the world, what our particular sovereignty, our uniqueness, our diversity, and our cultural expressions in what we want, particularly in AI, can particularly demonstrate. So that's in the African context. Also looking at the AU's continental AI strategy and various different AI policies released across different states. I'm seeing that there's also this very big focus on sovereignty, on data, on becoming very uniquely African in the way that we approach our AI and our other emerging technologies. And I think that's something that we can certainly hold on to as the rest of the world also tries to work it out. But I do think that our approach is rather intentional.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's so grounded in our values. You know, you've even seen, you know, the word and the concept of Ubuntu come up in policy documents where, you know, we really wanted to ground AI policy in our development goals as well, which I think is, you know, our sustainable development goals, because that also, you know, and, you know, linking it also to our sustainable development goals for the environment, because there is a analogy to be made here in terms of climate change and global warming with Africa and other global south continents and states experiencing the biggest burden of climate change,
Yes.
while we contributed to the least, right? And we're seeing that with AI now as well, where we are experiencing the burden of AI, you know, the impact that data centers has on the environment, data mining, you know, like stealing our data and not having control over it, and a whole bunch of other things. While we're not the ones that have control over the AI, but we're feeling that burden a lot more, you know. So, you know, and I think also you see in a lot of African policy documents, AI policy documents, they're talking about the environment and the sustainability of AI, which you're not seeing that much of in, you know, the United States, for example. I think the EU is definitely more geared towards that. Yeah, so no, it's very interesting. Just all these it's just so multidimensional. I think how AI is impacting states and their sovereignty.
I think it is indeed very multifaceted, and I think there's probably more levels to it that will evolve over time, especially in the AI policy space across states and regions, that we will see perhaps something else will emerge. You've mentioned, for example, semiconductor chips, the hardware, I want to say, for lack of a better word, behind it. API tokens, all of those different facets of the technical makeup of this type of technology will become new levels for us to traverse, and that I think will present their own sovereignty issues, perhaps in a more commercial, I want to say, import, export, excess, and tax domain, customs domain in the near future. But Clea, I also wanted to come back to what you mentioned earlier, you know, speaking about, you know, the impact of climate change, the environment, envisioning data centers. And I think what you've spoken to there is that what we are seeing a lot of these aspirations on paper. It is now the process and the operationalization.
It's a
It's quite a
mouthful.
mouthful. But actually implementing what is on paper will also dictate how this type of sovereignty on the digital frontier is going to evolve. And I don't think we're seeing that yet. It's a case of, we want to do this, let's do this. And then a month, a year later, we're still saying, have we done this yet? And that's the step we need to overcome. And it's not only here, on the African continent, it's worldwide. Is that we want to see the processes, the implementation of, firstly, the protections for all people, what is in it for them, an expression of national identity. What we could potentially see state responsibility looking like, although, like I say, that one is rather delicate at the moment because of the opaque black box nature of this technology. But I think we will eventually arrive at some type of definition and potentially some process to be followed there. So that's what I'm also particularly watching in this space, is to say, okay, so if you want, for example, data centers, have you considered the impact assessments? Where are you going to put it? What are you going to do about it? What happens if you're asking for that data center to maybe be set up in another country that's not as water scarce, or maybe has greater latitude for that type of thing? You know, how do you negotiate that, and considering their their sovereignty and the position of their people and their interests. So, no, it is very multifaceted. It is like a very big onion. There are many layers to it as we peel them back.
Yeah.
But it's a very exciting time to live in, and for all of us to contribute something to what will ultimately be, I think, a way of understanding where we as human beings will stand in the world with using this technology. Again, to come back to what you said previously, as a tool and not letting it supersede us and let it use us as the tools.
Absolutely. And I think, you've hit the nail on the head with this operationalizational thing. There we go. I got to think as well. How do we operationalize all these principles? Because, it's nice to have it on paper. It's a nice thing. But you also, of course, need the political will to see it through. And, and here I think this is an important discussion, and I know it's a bit uncomfortable for South Africa, but if you create an AI policy document, it should be free of AI hallucinations, ideally. So if you can't even jump that hurdle, then how are we going to operationalize it? The idea of AI sovereignty. And I think what we're seeing now, what you mentioned with data centers, is a little bit of forum shopping. Which is also not new, where companies choose countries where regulations are weaker to set up data centers, to do data mining, and that's why we need global governance in order to decide on the principles that will govern AI use and applications. But yeah, I would like to before we just move to questions, I'd like to just circle back to our sovereignty question, broadly speaking, and linking it, to international law. So do you think that AI sovereignty, this principle of AI sovereignty that we're seeing popping up everywhere, is a coherent legal concept, or is it more a sort of a political economic claim that just borrows the language of legal sovereignty for negotiating purposes? Like, what do you see this concept of AI legal sovereignty actually entailing?
So what I would see, I think that it will eventually have to become a coherent legal principle or legal concept. I think at the moment it's more of I want to say a label. I think a lot of your states and regions today are now saying this is we've got to look at it from the perspective of what do we want ourselves for our AI, and there we go and we pitch it under AI sovereignty or frontier, what will eventually I think could potentially be frontier sovereignty in this space. Digital sovereignty was always a much bigger concept in not only encapsulating AI but several other emerging technologies that we began to see, for example, in quantum computing and robotics. So this idea of AI sovereignty, I think, will somewhat be an offshoot of that particular concept to become a legally coherent concept, the boundaries of which I think are still yet to be determined. Potentially for negotiation, yes, I think that a lot of states and regions today are using it, potentially as a tool to say this is who we are. If you want to deploy an AI tool in our jurisdiction, these are the requirements or the conditions that we want to meet. But as it also comes back to what you said earlier, is that sometimes areas where weak regulation and weak governance are part of the day-to-day fabric, that usually doesn't happen, and sometimes it's the AI sovereignty there, if we could picture it like that, is non-existent. Then it's a case of it's more for investment or it'll bring perhaps some kind of income into the country, create jobs and so forth. So there's both positive and negative aspects to it. But I think it can still be a very, very much, it'll become a legal principle, coherent legal principle, if I can put it that way. Not totally unremoved from how we understand traditional sovereignty in international law. But it will have the, I want to say it's going to have the technological and digital aspect to it, and the cyber aspect to consider where are the boundaries actually going to lie now, where we have AI as a technology itself whose capabilities are really expanding faster than we can actually regulate. So now I do think potentially we are seeing it develop as a legal, definitely as a legal concept and principle to consider in future. I think the boundaries just need to be properly defined, if I can put it that way, Clea.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think I think right now I see it more as sort of a political economic tool, tool. I don't see when I see it in documents or the way it's being discussed, and especially at this UN global dialogue, the way that AI and sovereignty was being discussed was less grounded in international law. But I agree with you that at some point when we define it, it's going to have those parameters, more legal parameters to it. But something I just wanted to add on to what you said about that the technology is developing faster than we can regulate it. We also have a tendency as a global society to only regulate. So, often we say in, armed conflict or IHL that, we regulate a weapon, one war too late. We sort of wait until something bad happens. Yes. So we're going to wait. So AI is going to do something really bad. And then we're going to be like, oh, shit, excuse my language, but now we need to regulate. So I think it's always, yes, it's developing so fast and regulation's not keeping up. But I do think something really bad is going to happen. Then we're going to be like, okay, we should have put guardrails in place long ago. And I'm hoping that we'll put in the guardrails in this case before something bad happens. But I also know history tells a different story. So we'll have to see.
I agree that we've got a very big chance to be proactive in this space because we are seeing, you're right. I mean, we saw it at the beginning of this year with the Grok and denudification deepfake saga at the beginning of the year where everybody reacted and said, gosh, this is terrible. Who are we going to hold accountable? How are we going to fix this? And it was really only after a couple of months that, although the damage was clearly done, I wanted to say that the tide eventually subsided, but it was also one of those where we never saw it coming, but we need to actually see these types of events coming on the forefront, and especially in this context of what the digital frontier is going to look like. We've got a great opportunity to be somewhat more proactive. I saw that at the UN Global Dialogue as well, that they are looking and trying to traverse what some of these concepts are. It's also the same for me with the work that I did with the Council of Europe, looking at some of the work that they're doing, trying to traverse different trends in AI. So we've got a chance now to be proactive, and I think we've seen what the technology can do. It's just my hope now that we can appreciate that capability as it gets stronger could lead to more drastic consequences if we just say, okay, well, let's wait and see what happens. And then when it happens, we say, okay, let's fix it. But we don't know just how bad that detriment will be for people anywhere around the world, especially in this already disruptive and uncertain technological age.
No, absolutely. So on that bombshell, is there any, I'll pass over to Danielle. That was, such a somber moment, but to Danielle, if she wants to open the floor, to Danielle and to Wolf, if they want to open the floor for any questions from our 4 attendees.
If there aren't any questions, I have one, but I'll go ahead. I'll open the floor. What happened with the Grok situation in the beginning of this year? That kind of piqued my interest.
Go ahead, Warren. Do you want to outline it?
No problem at all, Danielle. If I can outline it for you with, so what happened at the beginning of this year, it was around, I think about the middle of January, end of January. What happened was on Grok and especially on X, formerly Twitter, there were various really terrible images of women and children, especially in very sexually provocative positions, that started to circulate, and they were actually made through deepfake and synthetic media, and they were circulated through X and through Grok. As far as I can remember, people picked up that it came essentially from Grok. And what was happening was some of the users, especially on X, were going on and not only consuming the content, but then saying to Grok on the system, you know what, make these images look a certain way. So what actually happened was we started to see a lot of nudification images, sexually provocative images. Of course, of women and children in that space is a highly depraved spread around the world of what was essentially really pornographic and shocking content that circulated. And when it was found to have been, this was actually happening, I believe that several organs in the United States stepped in to try and stop the system from actually generating these images and to try and stop the spread of these shocking images that were doing by that time had circulated more or less around the world as well. And this went on for, I would say, up until about February, beginning of March, until somehow these systems stopped circulating these highly provocative images, and the AI model actually stopped generating them, if I can put it that way. But by then, I think the societal damage and the social damage to so many people that were exposed to that, and that actually might have seen themselves in it, might have known somebody that was part of that circulation. It was rather quite severe, and I understand that there was some legal action taken. Where it went eventually is anyone's guess. I didn't hear too much more about it, but I don't know if there were settlements or if they were eventually able to stop this deepfake media from spreading the way that it actually did at that time.
Yeah, I'd like to just add, so I think the big issue was that it was, it was like normal people that were posting pictures online, and then users of Grok would ask Grok to undress or nudify these people. So it was just like, ordering pictures that people posted, and then, yeah. So, Grok is problematic, and for many, many reasons. There was then a lot of pressure on X to change its algorithm and, train Grok better because they got guardrails weren't in place. As far as I know, Warren, those cases that you mentioned, some of them are still ongoing, from individual users or individual people that were affected, whose pictures were nudified. America is also another complicated issue because of state-to-state regulation. So some states are regulating it, and this is also a sovereignty issue. Some states are regulating it more seriously than others, but there was an executive order from the federal government that said states aren't allowed to regulate it individually.
I remember that.
Yeah, that they have to comply with this overarching framework that's not in place yet. But in the meantime, they're not allowed to regulate AI. So we're in a bit of a weird gray area in the US at the moment. And the problem is, this is where most of these systems are based at the moment, these AI systems, in a country that now has very little regulation. So, that plays into the issue as well. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else says from the floor. Please just unmute yourself. We're a small enough group if you have any questions. Also, feel free to type it in the chat.
Okay. While everyone is still probably thinking on what to ask, I just wanted to ask a question on attribution, right? So not really have much knowledge on this area of public international law, but where do we draw the line between attributing the responsibility to the states and to private individuals? Because I know that obviously the states are acting there are agents that are acting on behalf of the states and making these decisions. Someone is probably writing a prompt on AI and dictating it on what to do. So where do we draw the line that, okay, in this instance, the state will be responsible for a particular individual? Yeah, I'll just park the question there for now.
I'll start and then Warren can jump in. So there are very specific rules about state attribution, and if anyone is interested, it's worth reading the rules from the International Law Commission's state responsibility, commentary on this. But obviously there are very specific rules. So it's not like it can't just be anyone that acts in your state. So like a company that acts in a state, it has to be at the behest of the state, right? They have to have asked them. And then there are a couple of others. So, if I don't know, if Grok decides to attack a water sanitation system in Kenya, America won't just be held responsible just because Grok is based in the US, right? With state attribution, there has to be a very clear link, right? So, and there's a lot of rules around that that we don't really have time to go into. But it is the practice of each state that also plays a role. There's been a couple of ICJ cases on this that are quite important, especially the Nicaragua case, if you're really interested in how that state attribution works. It just becomes a little murkier with AI when we were talking about like being able to hide behind a black box system, saying, oh, we didn't know this AI was going to attack another state. It just did it by itself. And where we're really talking about here is the militarization of tech. And you're seeing that especially in the United States, but other places too, where there's a severe overlap between AI systems created for civilian use, such as by, Palantir, for example, is one big company that does that, OpenAI. And then this state or the government then uses that AI that was developed for AI use. It uses it in surveillance technology. It uses it in targeting technology during armed conflict and so forth. And then the state, and we've seen this in other conflicts in the world already, where an AI system makes a targeting mistake, and the government that used the AI system that was designed by some civilian company then just goes, oh, sorry, it was too black box for us. We don't know how it made this decision. Not our problem, right? So that's where we then go into like, these little slight attribution issues. But it's not as simple as saying, hey, someone is based in your state, they use AI for nefarious purposes, therefore the state is responsible. You can't attribute responsibility in that way. Warren, if you've got anything to add.
No, I think it's a very good question, Tebogo, but I think we're still very much in the phase now, I think, where and Clea, I think you pointed to this quite well, as we're still trying to work out who is liable for the harm. We're potentially going to see a new definition or a new approach to how attribution has always been traditionally understood during this time. But before we can get there, trying to work out who is liable beyond, say, suspending a state official for not checking the AI policy before it went to print, for example, it's probably going to be, the responsibility is going to have to be perhaps more restricted and more steeper than that ideal. And I think that will potentially also lead to us thinking differently about how attribution is actually going to work during this time, because I haven't seen anything yet, at least in any of our international fora, where they're starting to talk about attribution in a technological context or sense. And I think it still starts with looking at how do we determine who's liable in this case, which is already rather complicated.
Mm. No, absolutely. And I think the attribution, the only place where I've seen the attribution topic come up is, and only very incidentally, is with the laws. There's the lethal autonomous weapon systems. The discussions that have been taking place in the forum, also within the UN, but under the conventional weapons convention, right? That's the only place where they've spoken about, attribution a little bit, but also, like you said, more in the sense of accountability. Who can be held accountable and so forth.
That's the word.
So yeah. So, I think that's where you do see it coming up. But in terms of a broader sense of AI, not that much. But it is going to be interesting. Just because this technology is so dual use and so repurposable, right? You can't, and right now what's happening is we're trying to regulate AI in silos. So we have the civilian domain silo, and then we have the armed conflict or, military use, national security silo, right? And even the EU AI Act, some on our own continent, they all exclude AI for national security or armed conflict, right? So they don't regulate them. They only regulate it in the civilian domain. The problem with that being is this is like intrinsically, it's a technology that is dual use and repurposable. So it might be developed in the civilian domain and then applied in a military context, right? So
Yes.
and that's where we're getting where the water gets a little bit murky, and I think we're going to get into a lot of problems because the one side is going to be over-regulated and the other one not at all, or vice versa, and those regulations are going to start bumping heads.
Okay, thank you so much for that.
Sorry, that was a very long, it depends answer, as is lawyers. So sorry.
Very much so. It depends.
It depends.
Okay.
Go ahead, Privilege.
Sorry, hi guys. How are you?
Good and you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for the informative session. It was really interesting. And I was just thinking, and just now Clea has mentioned the aspect of retribution, especially being in the context of autonomous weapons and everything. And I feel like with AI, it's really become so in your face to such an extent, the way and the regulation. And I think there are some aspects I've been trying to follow up on a few things, but then there are some. I want to look at it from the African continent perspective, where you find one or two countries are trying by all possible means to let people know what exactly it entails and everything. But also, I feel like there are some countries within the African continent that are really lagging behind when it comes to the regulation of AI, and also not understanding the repercussions of what it stands for, because in as much as it is a positive thing, it has really come as negative. And like you mentioned the case earlier on, it's becoming the constant being of people's lives, in the sense that there's so much information that is coming through. You don't know which is good, which is fake, which is so that disintegration or trying to disseminate what is and what is not. I just want to maybe, I feel like within the African continent there seem to be challenges, and there will be challenges when it comes to the regulation of it. I don't know, what has been your sense when it comes to that?
Warren, do you want to take it?
I can certainly take that one. Thank you, Clea. Thank you, Privilege, for your It's a very important reflection and really an in-depth reflection on particularly our position here. If we look at AI policy developments on the African continent, and I think with the challenges, if I understand your reflection correctly, and how we look at the challenges, and as you said, how in some instances it's becoming the bane of people's lives. It's some of it is right, some of it is wrong. To try and tell is becoming a very important core skill. And I think it will depend very much on, firstly, the people that we have in charge of using it, of implementing it. Coming back, I think, once again to a sovereignty context, what are our governments, for example, say, what are they particularly looking for? And I think for us as people, we need to be able to look at that and to say, is that going to work for us? And we are moving into a space where public participation and having our say eventually will also become an important facet of how AI is going to be regulated on the frontier, whether it's here or whether it's abroad. It's going to be anywhere where that's also going to become rather crucial for us to be able to point out and say, these are our challenges. What are the ways that we can potentially fix it, and how can we collaborate in order to do that? And it's, I know somehow at the moment it's somewhat pie in the sky, very philosophical, but this is what we also need to aim for, especially with our governments and with our structures that are looking to adopt AI and, of course, implement it in a variety of different local, regional, and international contexts, as I said. And I hope that perhaps addresses your reflection. If there's anything that I've missed, please feel free for me to clarify.
I would just also like to add
Otherwise,
something. Yeah, I'd just like to add something here. I think, Privilege, one of the things that you touched on there is this idea of, there's so much information out there. How do we discern, what's real, what isn't? And I think one of the big things is AI literacy. And the question is, are governments responsible for providing AI literacy to its people? Or, should we have that in schools? And specifically the South African AI framework that was withdrawn touched on this, like AI literacy and AI education thing, and that it's important in schools. And it's not just about how to use AI, it's about using AI responsibly and ethically. But what I am seeing in Africa, and you touched on the fact that the regulation is so spotty in Africa, which is also nothing new, because it's a capacity issue. What I am seeing is how SEOs, like civil society organizations, are stepping up in this space in terms of AI literacy. And sometimes in collaboration with the OECD or UNESCO, but also a lot of universities, and again, South Africa is quite good at this, in universities creating think tanks and also creating AI literacy in the universities. But I think Warren said earlier is like, we're hopeful about Africa's ability to create AI policy, at a regional level, as well as a continental level, and then also some domestic. But yes, it's not consistent across the continent. But again, this is nothing new in terms of regulation and international law in general, because it is a capacity issue at the end of the day. If you're worried whether your people can have enough food every day, you're worrying less about the impacts of AI. So it's also a priority issue. I hope that answers your question, Privilege, but if you've got anything follow up, please go ahead.
No, thank you so much, Harry.
Thank you for your question. Okay, we should probably wrap up unless there are other questions. Danielle, what do you think?
I think so, unless you want to briefly discuss the South African AI Act, if that's important.
Maybe we'll just talk about, okay, we've alluded to it. So what I will say is we had this AI policy framework in South Africa, and it was open for comment for a while, and it was very broad outline. And then after comments were received, they drafted an AI policy, and then it started going through the whole legislative process, and then it had to be withdrawn because there were a lot of mistakes. And it was clear that whoever wrote it had used an AI to write the AI policy because there were provisions that were hallucinated. Yeah. So, which is, I have to say, not uncommon. I've worked with AI policies from all over the world. Everyone uses AI to write the AI policy. Like it's not new. The point is make sure you check it. But I think I'd like to get Warren's input on the future of South African AI policy, and then we can wrap up.
Gosh, Clea, I think it's going to be very, very interesting because on this draft that was actually withdrawn, what I'm hoping for is that the advisory council that's been appointed to assist the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies with this revised draft that we hope to see in January 2027, I'm hoping to perhaps see, I want to say a little bit more about, if I think about it in the draft that was withdrawn, there were very high aspirations to have various different bodies and organizations involved in driving South Africa's AI agenda. And I would like to see how, firstly, that is going to be perhaps put into more detail, or I'm hoping that ours is going to also be a little bit more practical for the lived realities of South Africa and where we find ourselves at the moment. I remember seeing in that withdrawn draft that they wanted to establish many of these types of organizations, and then we were asking the questions about our fragile energy grid, our water scarcity, land and spatial issues that were not potentially addressed. So if any of that is retained, I'm hoping that we're going to perhaps see a little bit more detail on how that is going to work. How is that going to impact on the national fiscus? How is it going to materialize? And again, I'm hoping we're going to see a little bit more talk about how this is actually going to be processed and put into operation, as it were, and how we are also going to scale our talent and our skills and our knowledge of AI in the country, because I can speak for someone who works also in tertiary education that we are still trying to work that out without any guidelines or direction aside for a responsible use, AI use policy. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a little bit more directions for industry and a little bit more understanding of how AI, if it's adopted and implemented here, how is that going to look practically and in terms of the scale that accords with our lived realities in the country.
Absolutely. So right back to the operationalization.
I did not want to say that.
I see you avoided it. You just said operated.
Put into operation.
There we go, operations. Perfect. Great. No, well, thank you so much, Warren. That was, as always, very interesting, and I hope everyone enjoyed that. I'll hand over back to Danielle and Teboho for just closing remarks, and then, yeah, but thank you so much, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you. I've enjoyed every minute. Thank you very much. This has been amazing.
Same from my side. I want to thank you both for giving us an hour of your expertise, and I think I've learned so many new things. This was fascinating, and on behalf of Sevilla, I really thank you both for joining us for a fireside chat, and I definitely think that this area under international law needs a lot of work, and it's developing fast, and there's several things we can do to try and mitigate that. But thank you. I really appreciate this.
I'll also like to say thank you so much, Clea and Warren for such an insightful discussion on the AI policy and where we are and where we are headed to. And I think that a lot of people could really learn a lot from this discussion. And also like to thank our audience who came through to join us. And yeah, I really learned a lot. And thank you so much for taking your time and just to share your knowledge with us. So on behalf of the Sabila Network, we are so grateful for such an opportunity.
Teboho will share the link afterwards of the recording, and then Tianwen, you can distribute it to your circles if you'd like. But for Sabila, we'll also share it with the crew once we're up and running. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for organizing this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much all. Wishing you everything of the best and to be continued, I would say. Onward and upward.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
All the
Thank
best. Take
you.
care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.